Imagine being a German fighter pilot in 1944, flying over your homeland, protecting it from waves of American bombers. You spot an enemy fighter in the distance, a P-51 Mustang. You know this aircraft. You have faced it before. You know its strengths and weaknesses. You prepare for the engagement with confidence built from experience. But today, something is different. As you close in for the attack, the Mustang suddenly accelerates away from you at a speed that seems impossible. You push your throttle forward, giving your engine everything it has, but the gap between you and the American fighter only grows wider. Your aircraft is shaking, your engine screaming at maximum power, but the Mustang is simply too fast. It turns around and comes at you with such speed and aggression that you realize with a sinking feeling that you might not make it home today. This is not the same Mustang you fought before. Something has changed, and you have no idea what. What you did not know, what no German pilot could have known at that moment, was that the Americans had just introduced something into the war that would change everything. It was not a new weapon. It was not a secret technology hidden in the Mustang's airframe. It was something much simpler but far more powerful. It was fuel. Not just any fuel, but a special type of aviation gasoline that the Germans could never hope to produce. A purple liquid that turned good fighters into extraordinary fighters. A chemical advantage so significant that it made every calculation, every tactical assumption, and every combat lesson the Luftwaffe had learned about American fighters suddenly obsolete. This is the story of how American and British scientists created a fuel that helped win the war in the skies over Europe. It is a story about chemistry, industrial power, and the hidden advantages that determined who would control the air. It is a story about how a liquid pumped into fuel tanks could be just as decisive as the bullets fired from machine guns. And it all begins with understanding a simple question: what makes some fuels better than others? To understand what made 150-grade fuel so revolutionary, we need to understand how aircraft engines work. Every pilot knows that engines need fuel and air to create power. These two ingredients mix together inside the engine's cylinders. Then, a spark plug creates a tiny explosion that pushes a piston down. This piston is connected to a crankshaft that spins the propeller. Simple enough. But here is where things get interesting. The more you can compress that air and fuel mixture before the explosion, the more power you get from each explosion. Think of it like squeezing a spring. The more you compress it, the more energy it releases when you let it go. Engineers call this the compression ratio, and it is one of the most important factors in engine performance. However, there is a problem. If you compress the air and fuel mixture too much, it will explode by itself before the spark plug even fires. This is called detonation, and it is very bad for your engine. When detonation happens, the fuel explodes in an uncontrolled way, creating shock waves that bounce around inside the cylinder. These shock waves can crack pistons, burn holes in cylinder walls, and destroy bearings. An engine experiencing severe detonation can tear itself apart in minutes. So engineers need to find the perfect balance between compression and safety. This is where octane rating comes in. Octane rating is simply a measure of how much you can compress fuel before it detonates on its own. A fuel with a higher octane rating can handle more compression without exploding. More compression means more power. More power means faster aircraft and better performance at high altitudes where the air is thin. So in simple terms, better fuel means better performance from the same engine without changing anything else about the aircraft. In the early years of World War II, most aircraft used fuel with an octane rating around 87 to 91. This was fine for slower aircraft and bombers, but fighter aircraft needed something better. The British, facing the German Luftwaffe during the Battle of Britain in 1940, worked desperately with American oil companies to develop 100-octane fuel. When British Spitfires and Hurricanes started using this new fuel, the difference was immediate and dramatic. Suddenly, these fighters were 30 to 40 miles per hour faster at high altitude. Their engines could produce more power, allowing them to climb 500 to 1,000 feet per minute faster than before. German pilots who had enjoyed having faster aircraft suddenly found themselves on equal terms. The fuel made that much difference. But scientists did not stop at 100 octane. They kept pushing the boundaries of what was possible. By 1943, both British and American chemists had developed what they called 130 grade fuel. This fuel became the standard for Allied fighter aircraft through most of 1943 and into 1944. It powered the Rolls-Royce Merlin engines in Spitfires and Mustangs. It powered the massive Pratt & Whitney engines in the P-47 Thunderbolt. Every major Allied fighter flew on this fuel, and production increased to millions of gallons every month. The United States alone had 17 refineries producing high-octane aviation gasoline by 1943. This fuel gave the Allies a significant advantage, but it was not enough. Engineers and chemists knew they could do better. The development of what became known as 150 grade fuel began in 1942. British scientists at the Royal Aircraft Establishment started testing new fuel blends, trying to push performance even higher. American researchers at Wright Field in Dayton, Ohio worked on the same problem, and the two nations shared their research. They were trying to create a fuel that could allow engines to run at power settings that had previously been thought impossible. The challenge was enormous because creating such a fuel required solving multiple chemical problems at the same time. The name 150 grade fuel is actually a bit misleading. It does not mean the fuel has an octane rating of 150, because octane ratings by definition cannot go above 100. An octane rating of 100 means the fuel performs as well as pure iso-octane, which is the reference standard chemists use for measuring fuel quality. Anything above 100 uses what is called a performance number instead. A performance number of 150 means the fuel can withstand 50% more compression than pure iso-octane before detonating. This is an extraordinary achievement that required adding special chemicals to the fuel and blending different types of hydrocarbons in precise amounts. The key ingredient that made 150 grade fuel possible was tetraethyl lead. This is a chemical compound that prevents detonation. When added to gasoline, tetraethyl lead interferes with the chemical reactions that cause fuel to explode spontaneously under compression. The more tetraethyl lead you add, the more compression the fuel can handle. However, there are limits to how much you can add because too much lead causes other problems. Lead leaves deposits on spark plugs, valves, and cylinder walls. These deposits build up over time and can cause engines to run poorly or fail. So chemists had to find the perfect balance between preventing detonation and not poisoning the engine with too much lead. In addition to tetraethyl lead, 150 grade fuel contained carefully selected aromatic hydrocarbons. These are special types of fuel molecules with names like toluene and xylene. These molecules have ring-shaped structures that make them very resistant to detonation. By blending these aromatics with regular gasoline and adding the right amount of tetraethyl lead, chemists created a fuel with truly exceptional properties. But creating the formula was only half the battle. Making this fuel in the quantities needed to supply thousands of fighter aircraft was an industrial challenge of massive scale. By early 1943, both British and American researchers had produced experimental batches of 150 grade fuel. The fuel was dyed purple so ground crews could easily tell it apart from the standard 130 grade fuel, which was dyed a different color. This was important because using the wrong fuel in an engine could cause serious problems. The purple dye became the visual signature of this revolutionary fuel. When test pilots at Wright Field began flying with the new fuel in early 1944, the results exceeded even the most optimistic predictions. A Packard Merlin engine, the type used in the P-51 Mustang, produced about 1,490 horsepower on standard 130 grade fuel at military power settings. The same engine running on 150 grade fuel at war emergency power settings produced 1,720 horsepower. That is an extra 230 horsepower from simply changing the fuel. In the earlier P-51B model, which used a slightly different version of the Merlin engine, the power increase pushed output to approximately 1,600 horsepower. These were not small improvements. This was a fundamental transformation of what the aircraft could do. When test pilots pushed the limits of what the new fuel could do, they discovered performance gains across every measure that mattered in combat. At 25,000 feet, a P-51B Mustang running on 130 grade fuel could reach 437 miles per hour. The same aircraft with the same pilot, at the same altitude running on 150 grade fuel could exceed 448 miles per hour. That is an 11 mile per hour increase, which might not sound like much until you understand what it means in combat. In a dogfight, even a few miles per hour can be the difference between catching an enemy or letting him escape, between dodging enemy fire or getting hit. Climb rate improved by several hundred feet per minute, which meant Mustangs could get to altitude faster and position themselves better for combat. Most importantly, these improvements came with no modifications to the aircraft itself. The same Mustang, flown one day on old fuel and the next day on new fuel, became measurably faster and more capable simply because of the liquid flowing through its fuel lines. But there was a critical consideration that had to be carefully managed. The improved performance came at a cost, and that cost was increased maintenance. The high lead content in 150 grade fuel caused spark plugs to foul more quickly. Valves accumulated more deposits. Cylinder walls wore faster. Engines needed more frequent inspections and overhauls. American maintenance crews adapted quickly to these new requirements. They shortened the time between spark plug changes. They increased the frequency of cylinder inspections. They adjusted engine overhaul schedules. The extra work was deemed absolutely worth it for the performance gains the fuel provided. Every mechanic who serviced these aircraft understood that their work was directly contributing to keeping pilots alive and winning the air war over Europe. Pilots also had to learn new procedures for using the fuel. The increased power meant engines could be pushed harder, but only when necessary. Running at maximum boost consumed fuel rapidly, and long-range escort missions to targets deep in Germany were already pushing the Mustang's fuel capacity to its limits. Pilots had to develop a feel for when to use full power and when to throttle back to cruise settings. They had to manage their fuel carefully, calculating how much they needed to get home and how much they could afford to use in combat. It required discipline and experience, but American pilots proved more than capable of mastering these new techniques. Now, let us talk about what the Germans were facing during this same period. While the Americans and British were producing millions of gallons of high-performance fuel, Germany was struggling with severe limitations in fuel production. Germany had very little natural oil within its borders. Almost all of their oil had to be imported or captured from conquered territories like Romania. When those supplies were threatened or cut off, Germany had to rely on synthetic fuel produced from coal using a complex process called the Bergius process. This involved taking coal, compressing it with hydrogen at enormous pressures, and transforming it into liquid fuel. The process worked, but it was slow, expensive, and produced fuel that was not as good as what the Allies were making from crude oil. The standard fuel for most German aircraft was called B4 fuel. This fuel had an octane rating of about 87 on the lean mixture scale, which was adequate for bombers and training aircraft but not enough for high-performance fighters. For their frontline fighters, the Germans produced a premium fuel called C3. This fuel was roughly equivalent to Allied 130 grade fuel, but Germany could only produce it in limited quantities. Even at peak production, perhaps two-thirds of German aviation fuel was C3 grade, but this still represented only a tiny fraction of what the Allies were producing. Many German fighters had to fly on the inferior B4 fuel simply because there was not enough C3 to go around. Here is where the difference becomes stark. By 1944, American refineries were producing aviation gasoline measured in millions of gallons per month. The logistics system was so efficient that fuel could be refined in Texas, shipped across the Atlantic Ocean, stored in England, and distributed to dozens of airfields without any significant problems. Germany, by contrast, was struggling to produce enough fuel to keep their fighters flying. Their synthetic fuel plants were being bombed by Allied aircraft, reducing production even further. Training for new pilots was cut back because there was not enough fuel for practice flights. Some German fighters sat on the ground not because they were damaged, not because there were no pilots, but simply because there was no fuel. The Messerschmitt Bf 109, Germany's main frontline fighter in 1944, had a maximum speed of about 400 miles per hour at altitude when running on C3 fuel. The Focke-Wulf 190 could reach about 408 miles per hour under optimal conditions. Against Mustangs running on standard 130 grade fuel, German pilots could at least fight on somewhat equal terms, using their experience and tactical skill to gain advantages. But against Mustangs running on 150 grade fuel, German fighters were operating at a fundamental disadvantage that no amount of skill could overcome. The American fighters were simply faster, could climb better, and had power reserves that allowed their pilots to be more aggressive. When 150 grade fuel began reaching operational fighter squadrons in May 1944, the timing was perfect. The 8th Air Force, based in England and conducting daylight bombing raids deep into Germany, was preparing for the massive D-Day invasion. Air superiority was absolutely critical. American planners needed fighter escorts that could not only reach any target in Germany, but could also dominate German fighters in combat. The Mustang's long range was already impressive, but adding the performance boost from 150 grade fuel made it devastating. Distribution of the new fuel was carefully controlled at first. Not every fighter group received it immediately. The 8th Air Force started with selected squadrons to manage supply logistics and evaluate combat performance. The British Royal Air Force also began using the new fuel in their fighter squadrons, particularly those hunting German V-1 flying bombs that were terrorizing London starting in June 1944. These V-1 weapons flew at approximately 400 miles per hour at low altitude. Catching them required fighters capable of matching or exceeding that speed where the air is thick and dense near the ground. British Spitfires and Hawker Tempests could barely catch the V-1s under normal conditions. Mustangs running on standard fuel were marginal. But Mustangs running on 150 grade fuel had enough speed margin to intercept these weapons reliably. RAF pilots developed remarkable tactics for dealing with V-1s, sometimes flying alongside them and using their wing tips to tip the flying bombs off course, sending them crashing into empty fields instead of populated areas. The first widespread combat use of 150 grade fuel by American pilots coincided with the Normandy invasion in June 1944. Fighter groups of the 8th Air Force flew combat air patrols over the invasion beaches and escorted bombers attacking German positions. German fighter pilots began reporting encounters with American Mustangs that performed beyond anything they had experienced before. These reports started accumulating in Luftwaffe intelligence files, describing American fighters that could not be caught in any situation, that could accelerate away from German interceptors with ease, and that seemed to have unlimited power reserves. Initially, German intelligence officers dismissed these reports as mistakes or exaggerations. They reasoned that German pilots were tired, outnumbered, and facing mounting stress. The reports of superior American performance were surely just the result of fatigue and low morale rather than actual improvements in American aircraft. This was a serious misjudgment. The truth was that American fighters had indeed become significantly more capable, but German intelligence would not fully understand this until after the war ended. Gerhard Barkhorn, a Luftwaffe ace with 275 victories, flew combat missions against American fighters over Germany in 1944. After the war, he spoke about his shock at the performance of late-war American fighters, particularly the Mustang. Barkhorn, who test-flew captured American aircraft after Germany was defeated, noted that the Mustang impressed him greatly with its speed, climb capability, and high-altitude performance. What Barkhorn and other German pilots did not realize during combat was that they were facing aircraft whose performance had been chemically enhanced beyond design specifications, operating at power settings the original engineers had never imagined possible. The psychological impact on German pilots was devastating. They were already outnumbered, often facing formations of American fighters that had 3 or 4 times as many aircraft. Now they also had to face fighters that were simply faster and more powerful than their own. Their tactical options became very limited. They could attempt mass attacks, hoping that numbers would overwhelm the escorts. They could refuse combat entirely, preserving their aircraft and pilots for another day. Or they could engage and likely be shot down by Mustangs flown by increasingly confident and aggressive American pilots. None of these options were good. Combat reports from the summer and fall of 1944 tell the story of a German fighter force in terminal decline. 8th Air Force fighter groups equipped with 150 grade fuel reported higher kill ratios and greater success in preventing German fighters from attacking bomber formations. German fighters that had previously been able to make quick slashing attacks and then run away now found themselves unable to escape. American Mustang pilots could catch them, chase them down, and destroy them. The speed advantage provided by the new fuel was proving decisive in engagement after engagement. One notable combat occurred on August 6, 1944, when Lieutenant Hollis Bud Nalin of the 357th Fighter Group encountered German fighters over Eastern Europe. Flying his P-51D named Hellsbells and running on 150 grade fuel, Nalin engaged a Messerschmitt Bf-109 flown by Günther Rall. In the combat that followed, Nalin's speed advantage proved critical. He closed on Rall's aircraft rapidly and fired a burst that damaged the cooling system. Rall managed to crash land his damaged fighter near German lines and survived. For 40 years, Rall wondered why the American pilot had not finished him off. When historians later connected the two men and arranged a meeting, Rall acknowledged that Nalin's Mustang had demonstrated performance that exceeded anything he had previously encountered. The speed with which Nalin had closed and the obvious power reserves had been unlike any previous combat. By late 1944, the Luftwaffe was facing a crisis that went far beyond just inferior fuel. Allied bombing of German synthetic fuel plants, particularly raids in May and June 1944, had severely damaged production capability. German fighters were being rationed fuel. Training flights for new pilots were cut back drastically. Many German pilots reached combat units with only a fraction of the flying hours that American pilots had. They were being sent into combat against veteran American pilots flying superior aircraft powered by superior fuel. The results were predictable and tragic for the Germans. Between January and May 1944, before the widespread introduction of 150 grade fuel, American bomber formations suffered loss rates of about 3 to 6% per mission. These were painful but sustainable losses. Between June and December 1944, after introduction of the new fuel and achievement of air superiority, loss rates dropped to under 2% per mission. American fighters were claiming victories at an extraordinary rate. P-51 groups across the 8th, 9th, and 15th Air Forces claimed approximately 4,950 German aircraft destroyed in air combat between late 1943 and May 1945. With a large portion of those victories coming after June 1944 when the new fuel became available. The German fighter pilot force, which had entered 1944 with substantial experience despite heavy losses on the Eastern Front, was systematically destroyed over the skies of Germany. By D-Day on June 6, 1944, only 2 Luftwaffe aircraft appeared over the Normandy beaches despite Germany still possessing thousands of fighters. They lacked fuel, lacked trained pilots, and lacked any tactical flexibility to use their remaining resources effectively. The Luftwaffe was being defeated not just by superior numbers, but by superior technology, superior logistics, and superior industrial capacity. The production statistics for 150 grade fuel tell a remarkable story of industrial mobilization. Between May 1944 and April 1945, the 8th Air Force alone consumed over 53 million gallons of the fuel. Total Allied production across all refineries likely exceeded 200 million gallons during the period of operational use. Each gallon required sophisticated refining infrastructure, chemical additives including dangerous tetraethyl lead, quality control testing, transportation across the Atlantic Ocean, secure storage facilities in England, and distribution to dozens of fighter bases. The logistics involved were staggering, yet the system worked smoothly and efficiently. American industrial capacity in 1944 operated at levels that seemed almost beyond belief. Factories were producing bombers by the thousands and fighters by the tens of thousands. Shipyards were launching Liberty cargo ships faster than German submarines could sink them. Oil refineries were producing aviation gasoline in quantities that exceeded Germany's total fuel production across all grades. This resulted from decades of industrial development, vast natural resources, a homeland protected from enemy bombing, and a workforce that included millions of women who had taken factory jobs to support the war effort. The Royal Air Force made extensive use of 150 grade fuel in their operations over Europe. British squadrons flying Spitfire 14s, Hawker Tempest 5s, and Mustang variants received priority allocation of the new fuel. RAF pilots reported similar performance improvements to those experienced by American pilots. The Tempest, already one of the fastest piston engine fighters in service, became even more formidable with the new fuel. Tempest squadrons achieved remarkable success against V-1 flying bombs. Between June and September 1944, RAF 150 wing Tempests shot down 638 flying bombs. Individual pilots achieved extraordinary scores. Squadron leader Joseph Barry shot down 59 V-1s. Belgian ace squadron leader Remy van Leerd destroyed 44. Wing commander Roland Beaumont destroyed 31. The performance margin provided by 150 grade fuel proved valuable in every role these fighters flew. The combat effectiveness of the new fuel was demonstrated repeatedly through late 1944 and early 1945. By March 1945, virtually every P-51 unit in Europe was running on 150 grade fuel. Combat reports from this period show overwhelmingly one-sided results. German fighters rarely challenged Allied formations. When they did fight, they usually suffered devastating losses. By April 1945, missions over Germany often encountered no aerial opposition at all. The Luftwaffe had been finished, destroyed by a combination of attrition, fuel shortages, and the systematic elimination of experienced pilots who could not be replaced. When Germany surrendered on May 8, 1945, the air war over Europe ended with absolute Allied air supremacy. This supremacy had many causes, all of which worked together. The P-51 Mustang's exceptional range was crucial, allowing escorts to accompany bombers anywhere in German-controlled territory. American pilot training was excellent, producing aviators with hundreds of flying hours before they ever saw combat. Allied numerical superiority was overwhelming, with the ability to replace losses faster than they could be inflicted. But the petroleum engineering advantage that 150 grade fuel provided was a significant factor that cannot be ignored. The purple-dyed gasoline turned already good fighters into exceptional fighters, gave Allied pilots confidence that their aircraft would respond when needed, and represented the accumulated technological and industrial power of nations that could outproduce, out-innovate, and ultimately outlast their opponents. Speed matters enormously in aerial combat. A faster fighter can choose when to engage and when to escape. A faster fighter has tactical flexibility that slower opponents simply do not have. A faster fighter can control the terms of combat, deciding whether to fight or run based on the situation. When American fighters became demonstrably faster through the combination of excellent airframe design and superior fuel, the Luftwaffe's tactical options narrowed to almost nothing. German pilots found themselves unable to catch American fighters that were running away, unable to escape from American fighters that were pursuing, and unable to break off combat when things went badly. The contrast between German and Allied situations in late 1944 and early 1945 was stark and tragic for Germany. Allied fighters could fly multiple combat missions daily, limited only by pilot fatigue and routine aircraft maintenance. German fighters often sat grounded for lack of fuel. When they did fly, they operated under strict fuel conservation measures that limited their combat capability. A German pilot who used too much fuel in combat might not have enough to return to base. An Allied pilot could use full power whenever needed, confident that adequate fuel reserves existed for the return flight. This operational flexibility had profound strategic implications. Allied fighters could maintain standing patrols over specific areas, react aggressively to any threat, and sustain operations continuously day after day. German fighters had to carefully pick their moments to engage, conserve fuel rigorously during any combat, and often break off engagements not because they were losing the fight, but because they were running low on fuel. German pilots flew knowing that every mission might be their last, not because they feared being shot down, but because there might not be enough fuel for another sortie. Allied pilots flew with confidence born from material superiority. They knew their aircraft were fast, their fuel was plentiful, and their support system was robust and reliable. This confidence translated directly into more aggressive tactics, better combat results, and higher survival rates. Pilots who know they have performance advantages fight differently than pilots who know they are at a disadvantage. They take more risks, press attacks more aggressively, and show less hesitation in combat. These psychological factors, difficult to measure but very real, multiplied the physical advantages the fuel provided. German pilots, already demoralized by constant defeats and heavy losses, faced American pilots who flew with supreme confidence. The outcome of such encounters was rarely in doubt. The story of 150 grade fuel is fundamentally a story about industrial warfare and how wars are won. Victory in modern war belongs to the side that can produce not just adequate equipment, but superior equipment in overwhelming quantities. Not just sufficient fuel, but the best possible fuel in amounts that seem unlimited. Not just trained pilots, but a surplus of superbly trained pilots backed by an industrial system that can replace any losses faster than the enemy can inflict them. The side that can maintain all of these advantages simultaneously across years of sustained combat will win. American and British fuel chemists who worked in laboratories and refineries never flew combat missions over Germany. They never faced anti-aircraft fire or enemy fighters. They never experienced the terror and exhilaration of aerial combat. But their work, measured in performance numbers, octane ratings, and manifold pressure readings, helped decide who would control the skies over Europe in 1944 and 1945. Every time a P-51 pilot pushed his throttle forward and felt his Mustang surge ahead with power that German fighters could not match, he was benefiting from chemical engineering that transformed crude oil into a weapon as important as any gun or bomb. German military planners had made assumptions about American fighter capabilities based on aircraft design and expected fuel performance. What they encountered instead were fighters whose performance exceeded their calculations, sustained by a fuel production infrastructure so vast and sophisticated that it represented industrial capacity Germany could never hope to counter. The Germans had focused on designing better aircraft, which was important. But the Americans had taken a different approach, making their already good aircraft perform better through superior fuel. Both approaches had merit, but the American approach proved more effective because it could be implemented quickly across the entire fighter force without waiting for new aircraft designs. By spring 1945, as Allied armies overran Germany from both east and west, the Luftwaffe had effectively ceased to exist as a coherent fighting force. A few units still flew, often with barely enough fuel for a single mission. Jet fighters like the Messerschmitt Me-262 represented a genuine technological leap forward, but they came too late and in too few numbers. More critically, they were handicapped by the same fuel shortages that plagued all German aviation and by the absence of experienced pilots who had been systematically killed in combat over the previous 2 years. The final accounting of the air war shows the cumulative effect of Allied advantages. American P-51 groups across all theaters flew hundreds of thousands of fighter missions. They claimed approximately 4,950 enemy aircraft destroyed in air-to-air combat and another 4,131 destroyed on the ground. These numbers represented not just machines destroyed, but also pilots killed, experience lost, and German industrial capacity wasted building replacements that were themselves destroyed before achieving any strategic effect. The destruction was total and irreversible. 150 grade fuel was not solely responsible for this outcome. That would be an overstatement. But it was a significant contributing factor that amplified every other advantage the Allies possessed. It represented the margin of superiority that made the difference between a competitive fight and a decisive victory. The 448 miles per hour that a properly boosted P-51 could achieve on 150 grade fuel represented not just velocity, but technological superiority, industrial capacity, and national will. This is what German planners had failed to anticipate. That American fuel chemists and petroleum engineers working thousands of miles from any battlefield could create a weapon as effective as any aircraft or bomb. That purple-dyed gasoline flowing through fuel lines could influence the outcome of aerial combat as surely as superior tactics or better training. The lesson is clear and timeless. Wars are won not just on battlefields, but in factories, laboratories, and refineries. They are won by nations that can mobilize their industrial capacity, apply scientific knowledge, and sustain production of superior materials over years of conflict. The side that can do all of this while also training excellent personnel, developing sound tactics, and maintaining morale will prevail. The P-51 Mustangs that flew over Berlin in early 1944 were remarkable aircraft that impressed everyone who saw them. The P-51 Mustangs that flew over Berlin in early 1945 were the same aircraft in terms of basic design, but they were powered by fuel that made them faster, more powerful, and more effective. That difference, measured in octane numbers and performance ratings, in manifold pressure readings and airspeed indicators, was one of many differences that decided who would win the battle for Europe's skies. In that decision lay the fate of Nazi Germany, and a demonstration of Allied industrial power, expressed as a purple liquid pumped into fuel tanks, burned in powerful engines, and transformed into victory one combat mission at a time. The engineers and chemists who developed 150-grade fuel could not have known in 1942 and 1943 exactly how decisive their work would prove to be. They were solving technical problems, trying to push the boundaries of what was chemically possible. They were doing their jobs, applying their knowledge and skills to support the war effort. Yet their contribution was as important as that of the aircraft designers, the pilots, the ground crews, and everyone else who worked to achieve air superiority. This is often how wars are won, through the accumulated efforts of thousands of people doing thousands of different jobs, all contributing to a common goal. The Luftwaffe never developed an equivalent to 150-grade fuel. Their synthetic fuel programs, limited by resources and technology, could not match Allied achievements. Some German sources suggested that late war C3 fuel approached performance numbers of 150, but production remained limited and quality inconsistent. Even if Germany had developed such a fuel, they lacked the industrial capacity to produce it in the quantities needed. The Allied advantage was not just in chemistry, but in the entire industrial system that could take a laboratory formula and scale it up to millions of gallons of production. That system, built over decades of economic development, was something Germany could not replicate during wartime. For the German pilots who survived the war, the memory of facing American Mustangs in 1944 and 1945 remained vivid. They spoke of the helpless feeling of watching American fighters accelerate away from them, knowing there was nothing they could do. They remembered the frustration of breaking off combat not because they wanted to, but because they had to conserve fuel. They recalled the demoralizing sight of American formations flying over Germany unopposed, knowing that their own side lacked the resources to challenge them effectively. These memories spoke to the totality of Allied superiority in the final years of the war, a superiority built on many factors working together, one of which was the purple fuel that flowed through American fuel tanks. Today, more than 70 years after the end of World War II, the story of 150-grade fuel remains a fascinating example of how technical advantages shape military outcomes. It reminds us that warfare is not just about courage and tactics, but also about technology, logistics, and industrial capacity. The side that can innovate, produce, and sustain superior materials over time gains advantages that accumulate and multiply. Small advantages in multiple areas combine to create overwhelming superiority. This is how modern wars are won, and this is the lesson the story of 150-grade fuel teaches us. The P-51 Mustang remains one of the most celebrated fighter aircraft in history, admired for its sleek design, exceptional range, and combat record. But that combat record was achieved with the help of a fuel that most people have never heard of. The purple liquid that powered those Mustangs to victory deserves recognition as one of the decisive factors in the air war over Europe. It stands as proof that sometimes the most important weapons are not the ones that fire bullets, but the ones that enable everything else to work better. The chemists who created 150-grade fuel were warriors in their own way, fighting with test tubes and chemical formulas instead of guns and aircraft. Their victory was as complete as anyone in the skies over Germany. If you found this story fascinating and want to hear more incredible tales from history, make sure to subscribe to the channel. Hit that like button to help others discover these amazing stories. Drop a comment below and let me know what other historical topics you would like me to cover. There are so many incredible untold stories waiting to be shared, and your support helps make that possible. Thanks for watching, and I will see you in the next video.